In February 1999, the Cedar Lodge in El Portal, California, was a place for people who wanted to be on the doorstep of something grand. Located just outside the western entrance of Yosemite National Park, the lodge sits in the shadow of granite walls that make the buildings look like toys. On the morning of February 16th, a maid entered room 509 to find a scene that looked perfectly normal. The beds were made, or at least straightened. There was no sign of a struggle. But the three guests who had been staying there, 42-year-old Carole Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Juli, and their 16-year-old family friend Silvina Pelosso, were gone. They left behind their suitcases, their toiletries, and a rental car that was no longer in the parking lot. For the FBI and local authorities, it was the start of a massive search through some of the most rugged terrain in the United States. But for months, the forest was a blank page. No tracks, no witnesses, and no evidence that anything violent had occurred within the lodge's walls. It wasn't until a series of gruesome discoveries, months later, that the mystery shifted from a missing persons case to a hunt for a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight. Today, we are looking at the murders of Cary Stayner, a man who lived in the shadow of a famous family tragedy, only to create a nightmare of his own. Carole Sund was a woman who understood the logistics of travel. She was the daughter of a wealthy real estate developer from Eureka, and she was in the middle of a sightseeing trip with her daughter and Silvina, an exchange student from Argentina. They were experienced, they were careful, and they were staying at a well-populated lodge. The timeline of their disappearance is a study in silence. They were last seen eating dinner at the lodge restaurant on the evening of February 15th. They were supposed to head back to the park the next day, then meet Carole's husband, Jens Sund, at the airport in San Francisco. When they didn't show up, the alarm wasn't just a ripple, it was a tidal wave. Because of the family's wealth and the international status of Silvina Pelosso, the FBI didn't wait. They flooded El Portal with agents. They scoured the Highway 140 corridor. They checked every ravine and every turnout along the Merced River. The geography here is treacherous. Steep slopes, thick brush, and water that moves with a deceptive, bone-chilling speed. If a car had gone off the road, it could easily be swallowed by the forest. For a month, the investigation was a vacuum. Then, on March 18th, a tip led searchers to a remote area of the Stanislaus National Forest, about a 2-hour drive from the lodge. Tucked deep in a grove of trees was a site that ended any hope of a rescue. It was the Sund's rental car, a red Pontiac Grand Prix. It had been driven into the brush and torched. Inside the trunk, investigators found the charred remains of Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso. But Juli Sund was not in the car. The search shifted to a new, more desperate phase. A week later, a hand-drawn map was sent to the FBI. It was a crude sketch, but it was accurate. It led agents to a spot near Moccasin Point, overlooking Lake Don Pedro. There, they found 15-year-old Juli. The silence of the forest had been replaced by a forensic nightmare, but the killer had left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no trail back to the Cedar Lodge. In the wake of the Sund murders, the FBI faced immense pressure. When a crime this violent happens in a national park, the priority is to prove that the area is safe for tourists. The authorities quickly focused on a group of local men in the Central Valley, men with criminal records and histories of drug use. They were part of what the media called a loose-knit group of thugs. The theory was simple. These men had spotted the wealthy women at the lodge, followed them, and committed a crime of opportunity. For months, the FBI interrogated these suspects. They built a narrative around them, believing they had finally cracked the case. One man was even kept in custody on unrelated charges, while agents tried to tie him to the Sund murders. The investigation seemed to be closing in on a group of people who fit the profile of a killer. While the FBI was focused on the local criminal element, they were ignoring the man who actually had the keys to the room. Cary Stayner was a 37-year-old handyman at the Cedar Lodge. To the guests, he was just part of the scenery, a quiet, helpful man who fixed leaky faucets and cleared brush. He had been interviewed by the FBI early in the investigation, but he didn't fit the profile. He was polite, he was cooperative, and he had a story that was so tragic it almost acted as a shield. Stayner was the older brother of Stephen Stayner. In 1972, 7-year-old Stephen had been kidnapped in Merced and held for 7 years before escaping and returning home. The Stayner family was famous in California. Because of this, investigators looked at Cary Stayner as a victim of circumstance, a man who had lived through a family haunting. They didn't see him as a predator. They didn't realize that while they were watching the thugs, the handyman was watching them. The FBI's focus on the wrong suspects provided Cary Stayner with a dangerous sense of security. He had killed 3 people, stayed in his job at the lodge, and watched the world's most sophisticated law enforcement agency stumble for 5 months. By July 1999, he felt he was untouchable. Joie Armstrong was a 26-year-old naturalist who lived in a small employee housing area in Foresta, a tiny enclave inside the park boundaries. She was a rising star in the environmental community, a woman who dedicated her life to teaching children about the beauty of the Sierra Nevada. On the evening of July 21st, she was preparing to leave for a trip to visit her mother. The next morning, her friends found her car still parked in her driveway, the engine cold. When rangers arrived, they found a trail of blood leading away from her cabin toward a nearby stream. In a small meadow, they found Joie. She had been decapitated. This was different from the Sund murders. This happened inside the park, in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. But this time, Stayner had made a mistake. He hadn't used a car to transport the body. He hadn't torched the scene. He had left physical evidence behind. Witnesses reported seeing a blue International Scout, a vintage SUV, near Foresta at the time of the murder. Rangers and agents began a frantic search for that vehicle. They didn't have to look far. The Scout belonged to the quiet handyman at the Cedar Lodge. When agents arrived to talk to Stayner, he wasn't at the lodge. He had vanished, but the blank page of the previous investigation was finally being filled. They searched his room at the lodge and found evidence that linked him not just to Joie Armstrong, but to the 3 women who had disappeared in February. The handyman wasn't a witness. He was the center of the storm. The hunt for Cary Stayner lasted less than 24 hours. He was spotted at a nudist resort in Laguna del Sol near Sacramento. When the agents approached him, he surrendered with a calm that was more disturbing than any struggle. In the interrogation room, Stayner began to talk. He didn't just confess. He provided a detailed, cold-blooded account of his crimes. He described how he had entered room 509 under the guise of a maintenance check. He explained how he had used his knowledge of the lodge's layout to move the women without being seen. He spoke about the voices in his head and a lifelong obsession with murder that he had kept hidden behind a mask of normalcy. The physics of his crimes finally added up. Stayner succeeded because he was invisible. In a busy lodge, the man with the toolkit is never questioned. He had the keys, he had the schedule, and he had the trust of everyone around him. He told investigators that he had been planning to kill for 30 years, and the Sund family simply happened to be in the room he chose that night. The most chilling part of his confession was his description of the months following the first murders. He stayed at his job. He fixed the toilets in the very rooms where FBI agents were staying. He even spoke to the families of the victims when they came to the lodge to hold vigils. He was a man who enjoyed the shadow play of the investigation, watching the professionals chase ghosts while he swept the floors. To his neighbors and co-workers, the revelation was a total breakdown of logic. They described him as the last person you'd suspect. But Stayner's life was built on a foundation of resentment. He lived in the shadow of his brother Stephen's fame. While the world celebrated Stephen's return, Cary felt forgotten. He told reporters later that he wanted to be the most famous person in the family, even if it meant being famous for something terrible. Cary Stayner was convicted of 4 counts of murder. In 2002, he was sentenced to death. Today, he remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a living relic of a year that changed Yosemite forever. The Stayner case forced a massive reevaluation of how national parks are policed and how background employees are vetted. It exposed a glaring flaw in the FBI's profiling techniques and served as a reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always look like thugs or criminals. Sometimes they look like the man who comes to fix your sink. For the families of Carole, Juli, Silvina, and Joie, the official closing of the case brought an end to the mystery, but not the tragedy. They are left with the knowledge that their loved ones were taken in a place of peace by a man who used that peace as a weapon. The Cedar Lodge is still there. Tourists still stay in room 509, unaware of the history that unfolded between those walls. The forest has grown back over the spots where the car was found and where the map led the agents. But the silence of the Sierra Nevada now carries a different weight. It's a reminder that in the wild, the danger isn't always the terrain or the animals. Sometimes it's the person standing right next to you, waiting for the camera to turn away.